Let's take a look at the female sexual cycle. The female sexual cycle is those changes that occur in a female's ovaries and uterus over the course of a month. The female sexual cycle starts with menstruation. It's a cycle, so technically you could start the cycle anywhere, but the first day of menstruation is something that's easy to identify, so that's where we start the cycle. The typical menstrual cycle is about 28 days, but it can be shorter and it can be longer. It can be regular, where it's always the same number of days every cycle, or it could be irregular, where some cycles are longer and some cycles are shorter. Regardless of the length or irregularity of a sexual cycle, the same events are going to occur. So let's start by looking at the events in the ovary. Starting with the first day of menstruation, we're in what's called the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. This is when the follicles are developing. For the current cycle, there should be one mature ovum that's going to develop and eventually ovulate. But keep in mind that we'll have other groups of oocytes that are developing follicles for later ovulation, since it takes several months for them to get ready. The length of the follicular phase is what's variable. Sometimes it takes a little longer for the follicle to get ready, sometimes it doesn't take quite as long. But once that mature dominant follicle is ready, we reach the point of ovulation. Ovulation is relatively short and typically happens at about day 14. Once ovulation is complete, the remains of the follicle become the corpus luteum. This is the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. We form the corpus luteum releases a lot of progesterone, and then eventually the corpus luteum dies off. The development and degeneration of the corpus luteum takes about 14 days, and this is fairly standard. While the follicular phase may vary in length, the amount of time from ovulation to the end of the luteal phase is typically 14 days. At the end of the luteal phase, we reach the first day of menstruation again. While these events are going on in the ovaries, there are different events going on in the uterus. The first part of the uterine cycle is called the menstrual phase. This is where the stratum functionalis, the inner layer of the endometrium, is breaking down and being shed from the body. Once we get past the menstrual phase of the uterine cycle, we go into what's called the proliferative phase. In the proliferative phase, the cells of the stratum basalis, that part of the endometrium that stayed put, divide like crazy by mitosis to build a new stratum functionalis. This continues until about day 14. At day 14, or when ovulation occurs, then we go into the secretory phase, where this nice new stratum functionalis begins secreting all sorts of great nutritious molecules. And that really thickens and softens the uterine lining. So you can see the uterine lining gets thicker throughout both the proliferative and the secretory phases. This is in preparation for pregnancy. The uterus is hoping that once that ovum was ovulated, it's going to get fertilized and a pregnancy is going to be achieved. However, we know that most of the time that isn't what happens. There's no pregnancy, and then you don't need the big, thick stratum functionalis anymore, so it begins to break down in what's called the premenstrual phase, and then we see it leaving the body in the menstrual phase. It's important that the events of the ovarian cycle match up with the events of the uterine cycle. And this is all regulated through the hormones. So we're going to take a few minutes to talk about how the hormones of the reproductive system regulate what's going on with the ovarian and the uterine cycles. The whole process starts up in the brain with gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary gland to cause the release of FSH and LH. FSH in the ovaries stimulates the development of the follicles. So we need the FSH from the brain to stimulate the follicles to develop for the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. During this phase, the luteinizing hormone is stimulating those follicle cells to produce estrogen. So the more the follicles develop, the more estrogen is being produced. This estrogen is important in a couple of ways. One, it goes to the uterus and it stimulates cell division in the stratum basalis. That's going to help to build up a new stratum functionalis. So it's the estrogen from the follicles that stimulates the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle. The estrogen also goes up to the brain and decreases the release of FSH and LH. And this is important because that's going to prevent the development of more follicles while we're still trying to develop the follicles that we have. This continues until we get near day 14. Near day 14, we see a rapid rise in the level of estrogen. When estrogen's at lower levels, it suppresses the release of LH and FSH. But when estrogen levels get very high, they have the opposite effect. And we actually see that those high levels of estrogen from the developing follicles caused a big spike in the levels of luteinizing hormone. We see what's called the LH surge. This LH surge is what triggers the process of ovulation. So when the follicle's matured enough that we have enough estrogen, we stimulate the LH surge. That causes ovulation at about day 14. After ovulation, we get into the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle where the corpus luteum forms and begins producing progesterone. Progesterone goes into the blood and goes to the uterus where it stimulates the cells in the uterus to begin secreting. That's the secretory phase of our uterine cycle. The progesterone also goes up to the brain and suppresses the release of FSH and LH. So we see a real reduction in FSH and LH following ovulation because of the progesterone from the corpus luteum. Now, if there's no fertilization of that ovulated ovum, if no pregnancy was achieved, then after about 8 to 10 days, the corpus luteum degenerates on its own. So it has a finite lifespan. 8 to 10 days of kicking out progesterone, and then the corpus luteum degenerates. That's going to cause a drop in the levels of progesterone and estrogen. That quick drop in the levels of progesterone and estrogen affects the uterus. It causes constriction of blood vessels in the uterus, and that cuts off the blood supply to the stratum functionalis. Then the stratum functionalis cells are going to begin to die. That's our premenstrual phase. And then we'll see them being shed from the body in the menstrual phase. The other thing that happens is as the level of progesterone and estrogen go down, there's nothing to prevent the release of FSH and LH. So gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, stimulates the release of FSH and LH, and we start the whole cycle again, where the FSH and LH cause the development of the follicles that release the estrogen, causing the buildup of the uterine lining until the estrogen levels are high enough to cause the release of luteinizing hormone for ovulation. And then we go into the luteal phase where the corpus luteum is producing its progesterone to stimulate secretion in the uterus, hoping that there's a pregnancy. Except that there's not, and after 8 to 10 days the corpus luteum degenerates, progesterone and estrogen levels drop, the uterine lining shrivels and is shed, and levels of FSH and LH come back up again to start yet another cycle. In order to break the cycle, something different has to happen, and that something different is fertilization. If fertilization occurs, if a sperm joins with the egg in the uterine tube, then we form a zygote. And that zygote is going to begin dividing by mitosis, then we call it a pre-embryo. It's going to go down into the uterus and implant. Implantation takes place about 6 days after ovulation, after conception. It still takes about 6 days before you get to implantation. When that zygote implants in the uterus, it begins producing human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. Human chorionic gonadotropin is very important because that hormone released by the zygote goes into the blood, goes to the ovaries, and it keeps the corpus luteum from degenerating. It maintains the corpus luteum, so the corpus luteum continues to produce progesterone. That progesterone is going to continue to maintain the thick lining of the uterus. It's going to continue to inhibit secretion of LH and FSH so you don't have a new batch of follicles grow and develop, so you don't have a new ovulation. And it continues the development of the placenta until the placenta can take over the production of the progesterone needed to maintain the rest of the pregnancy.